Hello and welcome to a discussion on the topic of secularization, its meaning and the debates around it that have evolved in the time span of the past 2 centuries. Before elaborating on the topic, let me first brief you about the concept of secularization. Well, to define secularization in simple terms, I can say that it is but a shift of a society that has a close concomitance with religious values and institutions towards a society where non-religious values and secular institutions prevail. Now, in this particular discussion, I shall speak of the origin of secularization as a phenomenon of sociology and also of the context in which it emerges. The other points which require examination are the various implications and debates, particularly those that have emerged at the close of the 20th century following the works of scholars like David Martin and Peter Berger. All I can say is the concept of secularization needs some extrication in order to arrive at a clearer picture of the debate. I shall now discuss about the origin of the idea of secularization and how it came into prominence. Generally speaking, the causes of secularization were the cultural shifts in society following the rise of rationality as well as the success of science over superstition. As a social process, secularization is intricately connected with the discipline of sociology, commencing with the discourses of thinkers like Auguste Comte, one of the founders of sociology, who, as many of you might know, put forward his law of social progress on the 3-stage historical model. The other pioneers in this respect are Karl Marx, Max Weber, Emile Durkheim and George Simmel, who too occupy a primal position owing to their mutual concerns about the effect of industrialization on religion in Europe. While Marx looked at religion as a malfunction in society and was in favor of a society devoid of religion, Weber concentrated on the notion of disenchantment and on the dehumanizing effects of a rapidly growing bureaucracy. On the other hand, Durkheim's and Simmel's contributions lay in pointing out the urgency of social order, the importance of religion within it, and the separation of form and content of religion respectively. You see, the pioneers of sociology were very interested in underlining the importance of modernization for the historic forms of religion in Europe, which was linked not only with the power of politics but also with the involvement and legitimization of this power at the local, national and supranational levels. Speaking of Europe, the Industrial Revolution comes to mind instantly. The Industrial Revolution in Europe brought about a major transformation in Europe's religion, which may be termed as a culture shock, from which the mainstream religion of Europe could not pull itself out. However, the impact of this shift was not all-encompassing, as many parts of Europe, for example, France, continued to follow Catholicism, while in other parts the traditional and the newer forms continued to coexist. So, it can be said that it is the societal change from the rural to the urban setup which brought about a drastic transformation within the religion of Europe and the process of secularization. Let us now look at the exact meaning of the term secularization as brought forth by the approaches of various theologians, philosophers, historians, lawyers, and social scientists. Two scholars who have immense contribution in this regard are Carol Dovler and Jose Casanova. Dovler, in his work Secularization, a multidimensional concept published in an issue of Current Sociology, worked on the distinction between the three attributes of secularization, which operates at different levels of society, namely the societal level, the organizational level, and the individual level. His main focus was on how the authority of the church gradually began to disintegrate into independent bodies, and how people no longer looked up to the church as their basic provider and guardian body, because this role was gradually taken over by the state. However, Germany continued to be an exception in this regard, where the church continued with its welfare functions and thus preserved the church-state relationship. Casanova's work is quite similar to that of Dovler in many respects, as according to both, secularization has been the main theoretical grounding to look at the relationship between religion and modernity. Also, both Casanova and Dovler recognize that the confusion regarding the nature of this relationship between religion and modernity stems from the concept of secularization itself. So, you see, Casanova was of the opinion that a society inclined towards the modern was not necessarily one in which the religious beliefs were less, or one which experienced a complete shift of religion from the public to the private sphere. Casanova actually tries to put forward a valid public role of religion in the modern world. A second point which also comes to the forefront following his discourse is that the churches that have dissented to the structural differentiation between itself and the state have found it more difficult to come to terms with the modern ways of lifestyle. To prove his point, Casanova provides the examples of the two strikingly different pictures in Spain and Poland. Casanova found that in Spain, the modern forms of economic and political life had certain inevitable and calamitous results on the religious life in Spain. In fact, the Spanish church came to terms with the modern democratic system of administration only lately. There was a remarkable decline in the religious practices in Spain, and this decline resulted in a widening of the generation gap in that country. Whereas in Poland, we can see that there was a strong opposition to secularization. This is perhaps because here, that is in Poland, it was the church that was more powerful than the state, which was not in a position to be in authority. Thus, there was a resistance to secularization, and in this, the position of the church became all the more powerful. This, in turn, led to the rise in religious practices in Poland. But later, that is in 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the situation changed and the Polish church paved the path for modern democracy, and the position of the church dumped down. Now, I shall be moving on to the different discourses on secularization that came into being during the 1960s and 1970s. In this discussion, I shall be speaking of Peter Barger, who was greatly influenced by Alfred Schulz and also a number of other phenomenologists. Well, for Barger and other phenomenologists, religion was a social construct that was the result of the individual struggle to reconcile with the differences at different levels of human life. Particularly, Barger says that the sacred canopy comes into being as a result of these constructions, which shield an individual from possibilities that life has no meaning or purpose and other such sentiments that might arise in the course of an individual's life. To Barger, there is a need to give more importance to religious pluralism and its consequences on religious beliefs that might arise as a result of the emergence of a number of sacred canopies. You might wonder why Berger emphasized on the aspects of religious pluralism. Well, pluralism reduces the monopoly of certain religious institutions by starting the means of existence of alternatives, which opposes the older traditions. It is a key aspect of modernization necessary to study the link between modernization and secularization. It also reduces the reluctance towards religion alongside changing individual beliefs. Therefore, Berger's focus on religious pluralism can be suitably justified. I will now begin with the ideas of Brian Wilson and Steve Bruce, two eminent British scholars and theorists of classical secularization. I will first begin with Brian Wilson. Well, Wilson viewed secularization as a fundamental social process taking place in the organization, in the society, in the culture, and in the collective mentality. According to him, secularization does not necessarily mean that the importance of religion decreases or ceases. Rather, it means a situation in which religious thinking, religious practices, and religious institutions cease to hold their former integral position in society. Wilson's secularization thesis involves 6 propositions, which brings forth the changes in the 3 aspects of social organization, as I had already mentioned. Talking about these propositions, firstly, Wilson says that secularization is a once upon a time age of faith, with the focus on the exact nature of this age. Secondly, there can be different examples to this thesis. For example, the United States is different from Europe in this respect. Thirdly, new forms of religiosity and religious movements have surfaced, and these new types have replaced the older ones. Fourthly, the rise of fundamentalism can be considered as a global religious movement. Fifthly, there has been a recurrence of religion in the communist world until 1989. East Germany and Poland can be good examples in this regard. Sixth and lastly, there has been a shift of religion to the private sphere, that is to say, there is a privatization of religions. It must be noted that Wilson's view on the privatization of religion has been criticized by Jose Casanova, a leading scholar of the sociology of religion and a professor at the Department of Sociology, Georgetown University. Casanova's critique of Wilson's ideas led to the resumption of the debate concerning the public role of religion in the latter half of the 20th century. You must remember that Wilson in his study did not highlight on the decline of religious beliefs and practices, but on the decline of the significance of religious beliefs and practices for the society. He arrived at the inference that modernization and secularization are intricately connected, and that a large part of the modern world, including the USA, which are not relatively secularized, shall be so with passing time. Steve Bruce provides a very different picture in his approach to religion. He draws influence from Talcott Parsons, Peter Berger, David Martin, Brian Wilson, and contends that it is the Reformation that is of primary importance, which led to the rise of individualism and rationality, and changed the place of religion in the modern world. In fact, his attempt was to interlink modernity and the decline of the traditional forms of religious life in his work. You see, Bruce's view was that individualism jeopardized the communal basis of religious belief and behavior. He also believed that the more rational and individual grew, the more deleterious it becomes for religion, since rationality produced a feeling of doubt towards the long existent religious beliefs. In fact, he talks about how in late modernity religion entered such a stage where individuals could pick and choose from a variety of religious options. Thus, the whole concept of God became quite subjective rather than quite prejudiced. Thanks to individualism in religious life, no longer did people believe in the older traditions and in the power of the church. If you read Bruce's work, God is Dead, you will find how he took the example of Britain as a secularized part in a Western democracy, and how he beautifully spoke for as well as against the idea of secularization in this work. Speaking of Britain, it is important to brief you about the contribution of David Voss, a demographer. Voss was in support of Bruce's view and a follower of Wilson's definition of secularization. His work mainly focused on the declining social importance of religion in the modern world. According to Voss, Britain was increasingly ceasing to be a Christian country if one takes into account factors such as activity, belief, formal affiliation, self-affiliation and the nature of the state. Moving on to David Martin. Martin was one of the pioneers of the subject of secularization, who was dissatisfied with Bruce's view on the inevitability of secularization. What Martin did was to highlight the different routes that the process of secularization took in different parts of the world, and how Europe itself had different patterns of secularization within it. He specifically considers the examples of the USA and Europe, where he points out that the difference in religious influences are stark if one takes into account the south and north of the USA and the Protestant north and Catholic south in Europe. Like in the USA, one will trace a decline in the importance of religion as he moves from south to north and then towards the coast, while in Europe the Catholic dominated parts have increasingly become secular in nature. Because secularization of religion is a common phenomenon here. In fact, Martin asserted that in those parts of Europe where religion was officially proscribed, it became a matter of choice and not the main ideology of the state. Then, in his later studies, we find that Martin talks about the case of Latin America and the rise of Pentecostalism, a revival movement within Protestant Christianity that places a special emphasis on a direct personal experience of God through the baptism with the Holy Spirit. It is also important to remember that Martin's study brought forth the fact that the study of religion is interdisciplinary and that religion involved political process too, thus implying that the reorganization of religion can also provide for the needs of modern living. I would now move on to the ideas of some of the French scholars. In this regard, first, I would like to mention about Daniel Hervieux-Leger. Hervieux-Leger was one of the most notable French scholars who studied the place of religion in the modern world with the examples of our country. According to her, individuals in modern societies created the need for religion in order to fill in the gaps left behind by their unfulfilled aspirations in their real life. As such, secularization does not mean religion has completely disappeared from human vicinity, but it means that there is a reorganization of religion so that it can meet certain demands of modern living? Well, as a multidimensional concept, we can see that there are different dimensions to secularization, and that the different dimensions work independently of each other. Therefore, it is extremely important to maintain conceptual certainty and transparency, so that like things are compared with similar things, and thereby authentic inferences can be arrived at. This point has been repeatedly emphasized by Dobler and Casanova. What we see is that the importance of religion does not decline to a certain extent, but with varying modifications in different places. As Harvey Lager puts it, religion does not vanish completely. Rather, it undergoes a gradual transformation in this stage. The closing decades of the 20th century brought about a decisive break in the belief that modernization and secularization were generally connected. This could be proved with the help of the examples of Poland and Ireland, where religion and national identity seemed to be interconnected. The USA, however, turned to be an exception to this. This is because it was difficult to justify the continuing religious beliefs in a country which was so technologically progressive. If we see Europe, then Europe too ceased to be the standard for determining the different forms of religion and religiosity in other parts of the world. Gradually, the view that prevailed was that the secularization theory actually implied a decline of religion in the modern world, both in the societal as well as in the private sphere. Thus, we see the task of the sociologist in the current scenario is to explain the absence of religion instead of its presence in the modern world. And hence, it can be said that the 20th century debates did bring about a paradigm shift in the study of religion in sociology. With this, we come to an end of the discussion on the topic secularization, theory and debates. Thank you for attending the lecture. We shall meet again in some other discussion on some other topic.